July 22nd, 1970, NBC Studios, Burbank, California. Stage 1, home of The Tonight Show, starring Johnny Carson. The most watched late-night program in America, broadcast live to 30 million households every weeknight with the mechanical precision of a machine that had learned over years of operation to make the unpredictable feel inevitable. The warm amber lights above the famous desk, the curtain behind it, that particular shade of gold that television audiences had come to associate with the beginning of something entertaining. It was a Wednesday, 600 people in those seats, 30 million more at home. Nobody in that building knew what the next 90 minutes would contain. Nobody knew that a phone call had been placed that afternoon to the NBC switchboard from a hospital in Monterey County. Nobody knew that the information had been sitting in a producer's notes all evening, waiting for the right moment that never quite arrived. Nobody knew that the moment would arrive anyway, on its own terms in front of 30 million people, during a commercial break that ran 11 seconds longer than scheduled. What happened in Stage 1 on the night of July 22nd, 1970 has been described differently by everyone who witnessed it, but every account agrees on one thing. It was the night Clint Eastwood came completely undone, and the night Johnny Carson ran out of everything he knew how to do. To understand what that night meant, you have to understand who Clint Eastwood Sr. was and what he had built in his son without either of them ever discussing it. He had been many things in his life: a steel worker, a bond salesman, a man who moved his family across California during the Depression years with the determined practicality of someone who understood that survival required motion. He had worked at a canning company, a paper mill, a gas station, each move another chapter in a story about persistence, dignity, and the refusal to be broken by circumstances beyond your control. Clint had watched his father work, had absorbed, through the specific osmosis of sons watching fathers, a set of values that no school teaches and no book contains. The value of showing up, of finishing what you start, of facing the world without complaint, of finding in honest effort a kind of self-respect that no amount of money or fame can manufacture from the outside in. By 1970, Clint was 40 years old. The Dollars trilogy had made him a star across 2 continents. Dirty Harry was in post-production. He had his father's hands. People who knew both men always said this: the same broad, capable hands, the same quality of physical steadiness that communicates itself before a word is spoken. He had not spoken to his father that day. He had not known, when he drove to NBC Studios that afternoon, that it would be the last day of his life that he was still the son of a living father. That knowledge would arrive later, in a building full of cameras, in front of an audience that had come for something else entirely. In the 11 seconds of a commercial break that a producer would spend the rest of his career wishing had run differently. The sequence of events began at approximately 2:15 that afternoon, when the Monterey County Coroner's Office notified a hospital administrator, who notified a family member, who attempted to reach Clint directly before ultimately calling the NBC Studios main switchboard. The information was brief. Clint Eastwood Sr. had suffered a massive heart attack. He had not survived. He was 63 years old. The information reached a senior producer approximately 45 minutes before the taping began. A decision was made: to wait. Whether through genuine concern for Clint's composure or through the cold calculus of a production that could not afford to lose its primary guest, the result was the same. The carefully handled moment never came. In the green room, Clint had been his usual self, contained, unhurried. He had drunk coffee, had thought, without knowing why, about calling his father before the show, a thought he dismissed as unnecessary, a thought he would return to every day for years afterward. The show began. Clint walked out through the curtain to the customary applause, sat in the guest chair, and looked at Carson with the steady regard that was simply how he looked at people. And somewhere in the production booth, a producer was looking at a piece of paper with a phone message on it, trying to find the moment that would never arrive cleanly enough to feel right. For 20 minutes, Clint Eastwood sat in that chair and did not know. He talked about the film he had just finished. He talked about Carmel, where he had recently purchased property. He was relaxed, present. The specific quality of presence that made him effective on screen was equally effective here. the sense that the conversation was happening in a real place between two real people. Carson worked the conversation with the light touch precision of a craftsman who makes the work invisible. During the commercial break, Carson was approached. A note was passed. Carson read it. People who described Carson's face in that moment used the same word: stricken. The face of a man who has received information he does not want and cannot hand back. He looked at Clint across the desk. Clint was looking at something off camera, the relaxed inattention of a guest between segments. Carson stood up. What he did next, the specific physical choice he made in the 4 seconds between receiving the note and acting on it, was not in any production manual. It was the instinctive decision of a human being in a situation that had moved completely beyond the boundaries of his profession. He came around from behind it. Every crew member present identifies this moment, Carson leaving his desk, as the instant they understood something was wrong. Not wrong in the way television goes wrong. Wrong in the way human life goes wrong, without warning, in the middle of ordinary things. 4 steps. The studio audience watched with the alertness of people whose pattern recognition has registered something anomalous without yet identifying what. The audience went quiet before they knew why. Carson reached Clint's chair. He placed his right hand on Clint's left shoulder. Not a pat, not performative. The genuine, careful touch of a man who doesn't know what words to use and has decided that touch is more honest than anything else available. Several women in the front rows raised their hands toward their mouths. Carson leaned down, his face close to Clint's. He said 3 words that the microphones partially captured, that every person in that room heard with complete clarity, even though most were too far away to actually hear them. He's gone, Clint. The silence that followed was not the silence of a television studio between segments. It was something older than that, something that had no business being in a place with cameras and lights and 600 people who had come expecting to be entertained. Clint Eastwood did not move. For between 5 and 8 seconds, he simply did not move. His body remained in the posture it had occupied before Carson walked around the desk. One leg crossed, hands loose. The posture of a relaxed man in the middle of a conversation, and then something happened to his face. Not a dramatic collapse, not the Hollywood version of grief. Something much smaller and much more devastating. A slow rearrangement, the face renegotiating its relationship with what the ears had just delivered. His eyes changed first. The focused, present quality that directors had been trying to capture on film for 15 years withdrew, moved inward, traveled to a place that was not stage 1 on a Wednesday night. The jaw came next, the muscles moving not in the controlled way of a man choosing stillness, but in the effortful way of a man fighting to maintain it. And his hands, those broad, capable hands, his father's hands, came together in his lap, clasped, knuckles pale with pressure. The audience watched in complete silence. 600 people who had been laughing 20 minutes earlier. Several were crying, not for a man they had never met, but for the thing itself, the thing that happens to all sons eventually. Carson's hand remained on his shoulder. He stayed, and in the staying, in the refusal to retreat to the professional distance that his desk represented, Carson did the only thing available to him that was worth anything at all. It began in the 3rd row. A woman, hand pressed over her mouth, began to cry. Not loudly. The quiet, involuntary crying of someone ambushed by emotion in a public place. The sound reached the people beside her. The particular vibration of a person trying not to cry in a quiet room, which is somehow louder than crying. Someone in the 5th row pressed both hands over their face. A man in the 7th row leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, the posture of someone who has had the breath taken out of them. The audience had ceased to be an audience. They had become witnesses. 600 strangers bound together by the fact of having been in the same room when something irreversible happened. No one looked at their neighbor. Everyone looked at Clint. The cameras were still rolling. The director had made no cuts, would make none, later describing it as not a decision at all, simply the recognition that whatever was happening on that stage was the only thing that existed in the building. Then slowly, Clint's head dropped, not dramatically, just the slow, heavy forward movement of a head that has become too heavy for the neck that carries it. Carson tightened his grip, and from somewhere in the audience came a sound that was not quite a word and not quite a cry. The sound a room makes when it understands, all at once, that it is in the presence of something real. The commercial break that followed lasted 4 minutes and 37 seconds, more than twice the standard length. Nobody has fully explained the sequence of decisions that extended it. Everyone present says the same thing. There was no discussion, simply the shared understanding that the cameras could not come back on until whatever was happening on that stage had resolved itself into something television was equipped to contain. In the booth, no one spoke. The audience remained in their seats. Nobody asked them to. They simply stayed, the way people stay at the scene of things that have not yet finished happening. Carson had not returned to his desk. He stayed beside Clint, at his level, in the position of a companion rather than a host. At some point during those 4 minutes, Clint spoke. What he said has never been repeated publicly. Carson declined in every interview he ever gave about that evening to characterize those words, saying only that they were private, that they belonged to Clint. Whatever passed between them has been lost with the completeness of things that happen between two people and stay there. What has not been lost, what every person present carried out of that building, was what happened when the cameras came back on. The cameras went live. What 30 million people saw. Clint Eastwood, seated in the guest chair. Eyes red-rimmed, visibly raw. Hands clasped in his lap with the deliberate stillness of a man holding himself carefully, the way you hold something fragile. Carson beside him, not behind his desk, but in a chair pulled close, at Clint's level, in the position of a companion. "We've had some difficult news tonight," Carson said, his voice different, professional warmth absent, replaced by something raw. The voice of a man who has set down the tools of his trade. "Clint's father passed away this evening." He said nothing more. The sentence contained everything. Clint looked at the camera, the look of a man who has made a decision, not a performance decision, a human decision about whether the people watching deserve the truth of what he is feeling. He gave them the truth. "He was a good man," Clint said, the control of his voice audible, the strain in a cable bearing weight. "He worked hard his whole life. He never complained about anything." A pause that occupied the studio completely. "I never told him enough." The last 4 words arrived like something dropped from a height. In the third row, the woman who had first started crying pressed both hands over her face. Around her, 600 people sat with what Clint had just said, because those 4 words were not only about the man who said them. I never told him enough. That sentence left stage 1 of NBC Studios on July 22, 1970, and has never stopped traveling. It traveled first through the audience, 600 people who went home and called their fathers, their mothers, said the things that proximity makes possible, and that people spend entire lifetimes not saying because there is always tomorrow. Until suddenly there isn't. It traveled through 30 million living rooms where fathers and sons sat watching and felt, without entirely understanding why, an urgency they hadn't felt before the show started. It traveled through the decades that followed. 4 words in the right configuration, at the right moment, acquiring a weight that no biographer can fully account for. Carson had not spoken after Clint spoke. He had the wisdom to recognize that the absence of words was the correct response. The show continued. Carson returned to his desk, subdued for the remainder. The quietness of a man who has had something demonstrated to him about the limits of his craft. Clint left the studio that night and drove to Monterey County. He spoke about his father in interviews over the decades, always briefly. The father who worked without complaint, the father whose hands he had, the father who taught him that a man's worth was measured in what he did rather than what he said about it. He never repeated those 4 words in any public forum. He didn't need to. Carson described that evening, in the account of a close friend who subsequently made it public, as the night he understood the difference between what his job was and what it was for. That the desk and the monologue and the interviews were the mechanism, and moments like July 22, 1970 were the reason the mechanism existed. So that when something real happened, there was a room full of people to receive it together, and a man beside the chair instead of behind the desk. Clinton Eastwood Sr. was buried in Monterey County. His son, at 81 years old, 4 Academy Awards, 36 films, still has his father's hands. And somewhere in the archives, there are 4 minutes and 37 seconds of an extended commercial break during which a stage was empty and lit and cameras were rolling. Nothing happening except 2 men in chairs, one with his hand on the other's shoulder, in the oldest configuration that human beings have ever found for the moment when the worst news arrives and there is nothing useful left to say. Some losses happen in private. Some happen in front of 30 million people. The loss is the same. The love was always the same.